Right before the ascension of the Gupta Empire, India was going through a great change. Three major foreign tribes had come in and invaded India, and that had changed everything as they were pulled into the Indian fold so that they did not mix too much with the local population. Many subcastes or jatis had been made. This new jati system made the old Varna system something that is to be assigned at birth instead of related to the work that one does. Not only that, Brahmins gained great prominence. Since the Gupta Empire kings were actually Vaishyas or traders, Brahmins were the first people to recognize them as Kshatriyas or kings. So, to pay them back, the Gupta kings would give them land grants. These land grants would basically make them kings over certain villages or areas. Before this point, they were only considered superior in terms of religiosity. They were paid lip service by lower castes, but they weren't exactly considered that much better. But because of this, they held absolute power over the land that they owned with no taxes. So on these lands, they would have serfs or peasants that served them more as slaves or indentured servants who did not get any pay in return for their work, but they only got to grow food for themselves on the lands that the Brahmins owned. Most of these were commoners or Shudras or some or the other newly incorporated indigenous tribe members. These indigenous tribes as well as less powerful foreign tribes made the new fifth caste or the untouchables. The Chinese visitor Fashian, who visited during the reign of Chandragupta II, writes that Chandala people or untouchables used to announce their arrival by beating drums so that nobody touches them, and if they did, those people would have to perform penance. During this time, Vaishyas or traders gained a lot of money and prominence. The Gupta Empire was so rich that it allowed for guilds of traders to hold as much power as local kings. They could influence events all across the empire. So even they started performing endogamy so that their money stays within their caste or family. All of these factors and more combined together to make sure that endogamy was practiced within castes, meaning they didn't marry outside their castes, and a strict hierarchy was established. While the commoners or Shudras gained the ability to listen to shastras or visit temples to participate in the religious life, discrimination against them was at an all-time high. Now endogamy couldn't be strictly enforced. For one, endogamy wasn't the state policy at the time, or pretty much ever. But it was just because of these factors and circumstances that it became a thing. With land-owning Brahmins, ever-powerful Kshatriyas, and the newly rich traders, a new kind of feudalism was formed. Oh look, feudalism or the European caste system. But despite these lines in the sand, people still crossed castes. There were still intercaste marriages and people who moved up and down the caste system. And that provided the third and final way to create a new subcaste, aside from incorporating foreign and indigenous tribes into the caste system. Now, most of these mixed caste people were given a backstory from Puranic times to justify and explain why these people got to intermix with other castes or move up or down in caste hierarchy, and you, basically mortal peasant, don't get to. An example of that is Kayasths, which is my caste apparently. They became a separate caste around the time of the Gupta Empire. These people were from various castes and socio-economic statuses that learned how to read and write and took up jobs of scribes and scholars, taking jobs from Brahmins and undermining them. We are professional anti-authoritarian trolls since 400 AD. So the backstory that we got was that we are the children of Chitragupta, or the god that keeps track of all your karma for the afterlife in his ledger, and hence we, their descendants, got to keep track of everything that went on within an empire. From then on, any other person that rose to a scholarly job got given the caste of Caste, and they were added to the roster of surnames that are part of it. People of my particular surname rose around 600 to 700 years ago under the Delhi Sultanate. Similarly, many such subcastes popped up ever since, and they pop up to this very day. People do what they do best and mess with order, with chaos. Now, if you like what I have to say, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel, as it helps me reach a wider audience and spread this knowledge to everyone. Another thing that happened during this time was that women's positions worsened. An instance of sati in North India is mentioned in Iran, the same place I mentioned at the beginning of the last video, meaning that widows burning themselves due to the death of their husbands was a practice that had begun during this time. Now, this Iran inscription comes from a time after the Huns invaded India. So it could have been an adaptation of widows trying to not be caught by these invading barbarians. At the end of the day, it seems to be a non-religious practice and more a cultural one. Since Dharmashastras, which were the religious and law-based book based on this time, do not mention sati at all. They instead seem to prescribe an austere and religious life to all widows. It strictly prohibits remarriages, but remarriages did still happen. Women were not supposed to learn in schools, except kings made sure that princesses got extensive trainings of their own. They obviously knew how to read and write and were well versed in the shastras. They would also learn things that the men of their families wouldn't, like being clever and learning riddles and other such things. And so did many other Kshatriyas who did the same thing, and even Brahmins taught their daughters on the down low. Women weren't supposed to own property of their own, but they still did. At the very least, the upper caste women were not supposed to work. Instead, they were supposed to handle the household and manage finances if they were rich. And if they were poor, then they were supposed to do all the household chores themselves. These restrictions did not apply to lower caste women. They absolutely worked, and not just as prostitutes or entertainers, but as farmers, shopkeepers, artisans, and everything else in between. So they had more freedom, ironically, when compared to upper caste women, outside of princesses and heiresses of large traders, of course. Instead of owning properties, women got something called stridhan, which is a form of a dowry that women were given on the day of their marriage from their parents. Usually it was in the form of gold, coins, and clothes. But this part is very important. It was not supposed to be shared with the man's family. In fact, it was quite the opposite. The man's family often matched what her family gave her and gave it to her. This was also that if in some case the husband was to die or abandon her, she could have some kind of a fallback. In fact, if it was determined that a man had left a woman of character, meaning a woman who kept up with her duties, he would have to pay her alimony, or 1/3 of all of his estate, as mentioned in Narada Smriti. Both the marriages arranged by parents and love marriages were equally as prevalent as each other. Of course, both were supposed to happen within the same caste, usually. Strangely enough, adultery committed by men was considered a graver sin than adultery committed by women. Of course, adultery by men didn't include going to prostitutes or taking a second wife. It was only when they went after women of a higher caste were they punished, often with their life. They could go after even married women of lower caste and get away scot-free. That was bizarre. To go to lighter facts, chess was invented around this time, and due to basically a century long of stability and prosperity, it allowed for all kinds of arts to flourish. Not just that of structures and plays, but of music and dance as well. Many sporting events would be held to entertain the general public during this time. Auxiliary tribes would travel from village to village, town to town, taking their performances with them to entertain all kinds of people with music, dance, and plays. While there were exceptions, it usually only happened during festivals. Only the rich and discerning were able to hire dance and music performers for themselves on the regular, and that is how a lot of classical forms of dance and music started to form. Wine and pan were usually the vices of men, alongside betting and watching animal fight. Most people lived in joint family units, and this is how they kept their money intact within their family. In conclusion, major changes happened during this time period in Gupta era and a bit before it. Changes that would establish the way that Indian society functioned all the way to the modern day. The Gupta Empire, taking within its folds hundreds of new tribes, would cause an upheaval within the caste system. The land grants and the increasing wealth of the top three castes would cause the endogamy to begin. Women would not enjoy the same benefits and freedoms that they did during the Vedic era. But at the same time, there was an attempt to try to compensate for these losses. The attempt wasn't enough. Of course, new forms of entertainment evolved, science and philosophy flourished, and India saw wealth untold. Now, when the Huns attacked, when they did, and caused the destruction that they did, it caused all the orthodox elements of the Gupta Empire to become more rigid. All the ways that people could skirt and play with the order of the society lessened. From the next video onwards, I'll talk about an equally, if not maybe more significant empire. See you next time.